essentially, the people know the score. Mr. Trump would not have been elected if there hadn't been a rising tide of pointed ill feeling against ruling elites, meaning the oligarchy, meaning their democracy.
Did the people who elected Trump, did they know they were restoring the empire? This is Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius in Londinium. It is a beautiful spring afternoon in Londinium. The Thames turbulent, yes, but passingly not as frigid as it has been. Germanicus is here. We have our second cup of wine. The walls have ears in Rome, but not here in Londinium. The centurions are hanging around late, the retired centurions. Remember, this is the port of the Britannia, of Roman Britannia. So we have people passing through all the time, traders coming from the mainland, coming from with news of Rome. And we listen to them, but at the same time we enjoy ourselves speculating on the 21st century. Yes, there's a attention to the trouble in Rome, and we listen, but we're not going to resolve that. We're in Londinium, very far. Weeks and weeks of transportation from Rome. And then you still have to get lucky going through Switzerland. However, what we know right now is the 21st century deserves Germanicus's attention. It is not clear to the 21st century that the war in Ukraine is over. Germanicus is clear about it week after week, but we have to stay with it. We're going to talk about Ukraine. We're going to talk about Russia. We certainly are going to talk about the Trump administration. And then later on, we'll sacrifice to Augustus for giving us this stability here in the first century AD. And we'll go on to the theater. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. I understand it is asking much of you to explain one more time the Russian victory in Ukraine. However, there is some confusion in the headline writing in the 21st century about a negotiation using the word ceasefire. Kiev always insisting that it has a voice in the negotiation over its future. And the European Union, meanwhile, running around talking about how much money they're going to make available as loans for rearmament of a continent that hasn't spent money on its own weapons for at least 50 years. So, one more time, Russia's victorious in Ukraine. Why is that important for the 21st century to recognize? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. I think it is important to understand at the heart of all conflict, which we call war, that there is a series of phases, each phase of a war having its own dynamic. And we are right now in the final phase. And that final phase is not simply a period where victories on the battlefield drive a conclusion. Classically, that would be towards surrender or some sort of negotiated peace. But the political dynamic that has allowed the war to continue is ending even more quickly. And one of the things that the ceasefire push by the West and the U.S. has done is essentially signal to Russians and to Ukrainians that we don't really want to pursue this any longer. The U.S., through Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance, have done that even more directly and said, this war has to end. We don't want to continue to support it and all of its death and devastation. And so the capacity of a country, in this case, Ukraine, continuing to resist when it knows there is not only no hope of victory, but no hope of a successful continuation of the conflict, you're going to get a coming apart. And the insertion of the political management of the war and its politics into the conduct of the war is actually the decisive element that brings the war to an end, because wars can continue only so long as soldiers fighting and dying at the front believe that the country is behind them, but also that their leaders, the managers of the war, are competent and united, and that they've done their work in bringing in support, and in this case, the support of Europe and the US. And when that is gone, there is no basis for continuing resistance, and you get an unraveling at the front itself. This happened at the end of World War One with the Ottomans, the Bulgarians, Austro-Hungarians, and of course the Germans. Their armies just melted away, and that is in the process of happening right now. There have been tens of thousands of desertions recently, and so many hundreds of thousands have fled. All mothers in Ukraine, if they have boys who are approaching their late teens, they're getting all of their sons out of Ukraine. In other words, the country is coming apart from within in ways that might not be directly or starkly visible, especially when you have a news media that doesn't want to tell the truth and present the bad news. You're watching a country coming apart, and Russia's military pressure now is going to be orchestrated at creating signal moments of humiliation or defeat that help quicken that unraveling among the Ukrainian forces. And so I think we'll see some of that. We saw that at Kursk already, a highly dramatic Trojan horse brought down the entire Kursk salient, and the losses have been extraordinary for Ukraine there. And this is continuing now all across the front, from Zaporizhia all the way up to the Oskil River. And it seems as though Mr. Putin is not only in charge or in control, to use the inelegant phrase, he holds the cards, but there would be no reason for him to agree prematurely to any kind of cessation of active hostilities until all of his objectives have been achieved. And there is no countervailing force in either Europe or the United States that can leverage him into making a different decision. And in fact, what you're seeing it is Europe going up against the U.S. and a contretemps that's actually unraveling NATO. And of course, the unraveling of NATO only makes more certain that the war will end on Russia's terms. And Ukrainians are desperate to try and get um, some kind of path ahead through their government, and they're not getting that. And so I believe that we can see, as this unraveling continues, a replacement of Mr. Zelensky and a new, jefe being installed in Kiev.
I have a question about Europe. Does Europe recognize that the U.S.'s inclination to say it is no longer necessary for an American soldier to be Strategic Allied Command Europe, SACEUR? Does Europe recognize that that means it's no longer important to the United States? Does Europe recognize that not only are we turning away from Europe, we're not coming back? Do they see that?
I cannot imagine that they don't see that. It's like looking in a mirror, you see yourself. I mean, they see the end of NATO when they look in the mirror. And the best way to convey the end of NATO is to do what was done. You get rid of the symbolic and ritual office of leader, and you say, this leader who's always been American, representing the emperor for all of the vassals in NATO, and you say, well, You find your own leader. That is essentially an announcement of the end of the alliance. And the dynamics of this alliance shifting so quickly with the departure of Mr. Biden and the accession of the new emperor is in many ways um, not just a consequence of, but a function of the way in which Mr. Trump has approached Mr. Putin. And they have created, much as Napoleon did in after the Battle of Eylau and then Friedland with Alexander the First of Russia, meeting in a raft in the middle of the river Tilsit, the Niemen River. His approach essentially creates a signal, a kind of a trumpet voluntary that Russia, which had been, trumpeted earlier as a threat, can now be taken away as a problem. In other words, he is basically approaching Putin as a colleague. It's more positive than, say, Nixon approaching Brezhnev. It's more a little bit more on the level of Nixon going to China, because what Trump is doing is basically treating Putin as a normal associate, not a great power rival necessarily, perhaps a competitor, certainly, but a country we can work with. And that has altered the entire lens through which Americans view Russia. It's the whole notion that you look through this red lens and all you see is the Russian enemy forever has been replaced by an aperture which we can see a renewed relationship with Russia, normal relationship. So I think this is something that's turned everything around and created a kind of a new landscape that the media, for example, and certainly European leaders are having great difficulty keeping up with and digesting. They still don't see the fullness of what has happened. And or perhaps they do, because one of the reasons they can um, have the confidence that they can pursue their own defense is by essentially confessing that they're not threatened, because Europe cannot rearm
Right.
itself as a formidable world power, and therefore for them to say, to declare that they're going down that path must inevitably lead everyone to the conclusion that, well, they're just not threatened. So sure, they can defend themselves because they're not in danger of being attacked. Once that fiction of the Russian threat is fully taken away, and Mr. Trump started everything in that direction, then there is no basis for NATO. NATO is founded on defending poor helpless Europe against communism and the Soviet Union. That is all ancient history now.
Germanicus is here, and we can see our century very clearly. We learned as best we could, given the upset a few decades ago of the burning of Londinium, that we reside here thanks to the might of the Roman Empire. And we admire empires, and we're working on an imperial project in the 21st century. To get there, however, there are certain important details that we see clearly from our own time. One of those details is regicide. The quote, Germanicus, Gaius and I checked on this. Germanicus and I checked on this. The quote is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. When you strike at a king, you must kill him. I remember that vaguely, and we looked it up to make sure that it hadn't been manufactured. The king, the emperor, is in office now. Since 2016 at least, the resistance has attempted to strike the king and missed and missed and missed and missed, and continue through the period when Biden was in office and now continuing when the emperor is back in office. But What we've learned about regicide is that the emperor, to merit our attention, the strength of Rome, must pursue the regicides to the end. The example is the regicides of Charles I, 17th century England. Once the crown was restored, every man who participated in any fashion with the Cromwellian Revolution had to be tracked down and drawn and quartered in public. Had to be. The five major conspirators escaped to America and were eventually found, and their throats were cut. They couldn't be transported back to England. So, how is that a measure of an emperor? Because if you leave regicides untouched or unpunished or unvanquished, you invite doubts about your reign and whether you're worthy or not for people to follow. Germanicus, how's the regicide doing now? Mr. Trump has put into effect the tracking down of his enemies. Is he following through to your measure?
He is indeed. But here is a moment where if anyone was in any doubt that we inhabit an imperial system, the need for regicide should take all doubt away, should banish any uncertainty. You see, in the old days, early America, when there were no emperors, a president would retire and no one would come after him. It was unseemly and unheard of. And the president was first citizen while he was president. After that, he was a august figure. And we pursued that. I mean, by the time we get to the 20th century, though, you get into a situation which has fully come into flower, where emperors are attacked and not allowed to go into retirement. And this has come to a head in the case of Mr. Trump. It's been a war almost as though the Democrats represented the Cromwellian movement and a way of life that couldn't abide having the monarch, and overthrew him and then executed him. And this has become a situation that reminds us, or should remind us, of the essential element of legitimacy that was required in Rome. And the emperor's legitimacy was based, as you put it, on his ability to ferret out and destroy not just his rivals, but those who would have him killed. And this is exactly the place that America has arrived. And the attempt to kill, regicide means the killing of a king, the attempt to kill the emperor multiple times over the course of 8 years, all failed. And it isn't enough in a context where opposition must be vanquished for there to be the kind of good feelings or customs and norms of living peaceably. Those go by the wayside, and the result is that we seem to have entered a period where each president is an emperor who has to seize his own legitimacy through the destruction of those who would destroy him. In Rome, of course, if there was a short civil war, as we've discussed, this would be the method of succession. The former emperor was literally wiped out. There was something called damnatio imperio, where all of the faces, visages of the emperor and statues, plaques or the standards that legions carried with the emperor's face, um, they'd all be essentially defaced. They'd be destroyed. And we saw this as a kind of symbolic continuation of Roman practice during the height of woke, where most famously the statue of Robert E. Lee was taken off his pedestal in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, and his statue was very publicly melted down. Literally a damnatio imperio, although this was a long dead leader. The fact is that it's come home now to the point where any means can be employed to defenestrate an emperor and destroy him or kill him. Um, and therefore, the emperor having returned to Rome in triumph, as Mr. Trump has, it is incumbent upon him to publicly erase um, those who would have erased him. And that doesn't.
The previous emperors you've pointed out, Germanicus, acknowledges everything you say because those pardons acknowledge what you're saying is accurate.
Yes, I mean the criminal conspiracy is infused into the pardons themselves, as though it essentially announces uh, what was going on. All of the efforts of the courts were not efforts of the courts; they were efforts of a network of assassins to essentially commit regicide. The same with all of the legions of CIA
Right.
wigs who went after Mr. Trump. All of that
50
is
or 51 signatures of regicides. And the detail about regicide in history is that the reason you must track them down is because that's their life now to get you and to inspire others to get you. They're not going to once you commit yourself to a regicide, your life is over.
it's
You're
a
not,
ceremony. Yeah, you have to ceremonially um, you know, behead them or draw and quarter them, and this is all in a ritual context. So the corresponding ritual today would be to take away their security clearances, put them in a position where they don't have Secret Service protection, essentially do a kind of cancel culture, which in itself is the punishment of relieving them of their place in the firmament of participants. It's essentially branding them as outcasts. It's like the papal interdict, when the Romans had their own interdict that preceded the papal interdict.
Germanicus, democracy, democracy, democracy. Everywhere I see it, it's like a brand name. Pretty soon they're going to use it on household projects. What do they mean, democracy? America doesn't have a democracy. Are they aware of this?
Democracy is infinitely elastic as a political um, identifier. I mean, you had democracies in the ancient world, in the Greek city-states, but the democracy there was in many ways resonant to the kind of concept of democracy that its users describe today. In other words, it is the big men, the first citizens, the rich, the essentially the ruling elites of the city state were the democracy. And essentially, when blue or Democrats talk about our democracy, they mean themselves as congressmen and women, as heads of corporations, as what we call oligarchs, because effectively you have a very small group of engaged people. Some of them are called activists, others are called contributors. And those with the money and those who are courtiers in the imperial city and throughout the precincts of the palace, and those who were privileged enough to appear in the formal mainstream media, they're all players, and it is their democracy, or as they would put it, our democracy. And that bears no relation to what we know of or our forebears called a republic.
The republic is Congress. Congress no longer works for the people.
Right.
It works for the big men. Is the public aware of this, that it is being hoodwinked, or is it? Does it know anyway?
Well, the the oligarchy, the democracy um, calls the people disparagingly populist, as though that's something bad. I mean, essentially, the people um, are not to be trusted, and in many ways, the attitude of the oligarchy toward the people is no different from what you would have seen, say, in Venice, where you actually did have a doge. I mean, it was an oligarchic republic, and that they hate the people. They're worried about someone like Savonarola emerging, a firebrand leading the people to overthrow the elite. Well, essentially, the people know the score. Mr. Trump would not have been elected if if there hadn't been a rising tide of pointed ill feeling against ruling elites, meaning the oligarchy, meaning their democracy.
Did the people who elected Trump, did they know they were restoring the empire?
Not in Roman words, perhaps, but certainly in terms of realizing that only a champion, only a big man, a leader,
An
and
emperor. An emperor.
well, but it's going more to the Caesar thing. The emperor didn't exist as a concept that could be made workable before Julius Caesar.
Right.
You had men who intervened, like Sulla especially, and you had the triumvirs and all the rest. But it was Caesar who was able to frame um, a kind of champion or savior figure who would be trusted by the people to represent their interests because they had zero faith any longer in the Senate and the whole processes and workings of the Senate. In other words, the Roman Constitution. So yeah, and the reason the whole emperor system took root in Rome under Augustus was that this set of responsibilities of the oaths of office that the emperor lived to represent the people actually became the basis of Roman political life, in spite of all of the mythologies that have been bandied about corrupt. There were certainly corrupt emperors, but throughout the next 1,500 years of Roman history, um, the emperors had to serve the people, and they worked hard at it. And so that was the emperor system, and that is essentially what Trump has achieved. And he's achieved it because the people understood that he was their only hope, and they placed their trust in him because he spoke the truth, unlike the lies of the oligarchy, and hence the incredibly important task of fulfilling his promises now. The most remarkable thing about the first month or so of his presidency has been the effort he's gone to literally fulfill his promises. And I think this is day by day creating what the expectation will be in future if we continue down the road of having an emperor system. But that hasn't happened yet. Right now, it's still a struggle between a nascent imperial system and a corrupted oligarchy.
Which is why Germanicus and I keep fussing about it, because it's a
Right.
project. It takes time, and it can take too long. And that's happened in history. Too long means that you have a bumpy ride for a long time. You can see it afterwards, but not at the time. And we don't think we can see it right now We have aspirations. Trump looks like an emperor, but there are details. One of them is he must track down the regicides, and that's not done yet. The
No.
regicides are still moving around. Some of them are very powerful. Many of them are organized. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius John Batchelor. We're going to the theater. I believe the play tonight, it's a comedy, meaning it's a farce. There's a pot of gold. There's always a beautiful maiden. There's always clever slaves who fool the master. And there's a lot of running around. It'll be entertaining. After we sacrifice to Augustus, who got us here, the emperor above all emperors. This is the Friends Visitor Debating Society. Thank you.